One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, and welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. We're talking about detoxification, and I think we're in our part 3 or third installment of this little mini-series. And I would have to say that a relevant and accurate discussion of detoxification or biotransformation, using the technical word, it's a pretty important thing to do, just simply because most people, I guess, intuitively understand the need for detoxification, because I think they intuitively understand that in our modern day, especially in industrialized nations, toxicity is a real deal. And I talked in the very first episode about some of the statistics about the ungodly amount of man-made chemicals that we produce every year and dump into the environment every year, things that we're exposed to through several different routes. So today we're going to talk about the scope and scale of detoxification problems, because the reality is there's a lot of people that live in a toxic world, as we all do, who seem to handle their toxin load pretty well. And we can say that fairly confidently throughout the entire span of their life. It's not that they don't have a toxic burden, but they have what they need to be able to neutralize or nullify that to the point where it doesn't have a significant impact on their physiology and their health, as well as their longevity. But clearly, there are a lot of people who really struggle with it. And I would venture to say and imagine that if you are listening to this podcast because you deem yourself to be part of the Inflammation Nation, whatever diagnosis you may or may not have been given, somewhere along the way, you probably have had the thought, like, I wonder if toxicity is an issue, and should I do a detox? Should I support my liver? And in talking about this scope and scale of complexity with toxicity issues and detoxification problems, we're going to review just a couple of simple things, and it's just part of the conversation. And forgive me if I beat a dead horse on many different topics, but as I said just an episode or so ago, repetition is the key to learning. And ultimately, my aim with this podcast is to help you become autonomous, to help you become self-sufficient to the point that it makes sense, right? Autonomous health is all about being relatively independent of a broken and fractured healthcare system, and doing everything you can to take care of yourself. And then when you come up against a problem that you don't understand or you can't move the needle on, then you seek out help, whether that's in the conventional system or somewhere in the functional medicine world, whether it's me or someone like me. Anyway, so let's start talking about just the big picture again, right? Toxins enter your body through 3 main routes of entry, and that would be your lungs, your gut, and your skin. And each of these represent a barrier system. We've talked about barrier systems in different episodes and different series, but everything kind of interconnects and intersects. So it's difficult sometimes to have one conversation without revisiting some of the concepts that you may already understand, or perhaps you don't. And this is the first time you've heard of the barrier systems. But basically, when we look at the concept of a barrier, it's something that separates 2 different environments. And so your skin is a barrier from things getting into your body that you might absorb through your skin, or certainly if you have a cut or an abrasion on your skin, bacteria or even chemicals can get inside your body into your bloodstream through that route. And so we have barriers. The concept of a barrier is the concept of separation and isolation, but we also have the concept of breaching or breaking your barrier system. So whether that is a cut in your skin, or whether it is something in your gut like leaky gut or full-blown or frank ulceration, or whether it's a what we call leaky lung, where the lining of the respiratory system is starting to break down, and they're not functioning as sophisticated filtration systems. And so if we have a barrier compromise in the lungs, then the chemicals that we smell in things like fumes and odors, chemicals that off-gas from furniture and textiles, or even airborne chemicals or environmental toxins, All of these things we can breathe in, and they can get into our body and then contribute to our toxic burden. Same thing is true of your stomach and your gut barrier. The reality is that there's not a single bite of food that you take that is germ-free, or if you're living in North America, that isn't contaminated with some kind of chemical, whether that's dioxin or some type of plastics or plastic derivatives. So pretty much every time you swallow something, no matter how clean you are or how good you are at sourcing clean foods, and how fastidious you are in terms of trying to deal with chemicals by washing vegetables, for example, or buying organic, the reality is everything you swallow contains something that wants to either infect you or contribute to your toxin load. And of course, we talked about skin, and this has a lot to do with our choices in terms of personal care products, even laundry detergents or household cleaners, anything that you come into contact with as a physical sense. And so we have three ways that toxins can get into your system, contributing to not just your toxic burden, but the probability that you're going to break your barrier systems and therefore cause more input of toxins into your body, or that we're going to deplete the different ways that we neutralize these toxins, whether it is having an impact on liver health and physiology, or whether it's depleting antioxidant stores like your glutathione levels. All of these, of course, can lead to dysregulated physiology that leads to a lot of the complaints that people like you suffer from. And so we kind of have this stepwise thing, right? It's routes of entry and your processing and handling capacity of your toxic burden. And understand that most toxins do get excreted through your colon in your bowel movements, but we can sweat out toxins, anything that has a liquid type component to it, right? So sweat through the skin, like using some type of sauna or just exercising and sweating, etc. We also can breathe out certain types of toxins because there is a liquid component to breath vapor, although I would argue that's probably not a significant route of excretion for our toxin load. We have urination, of course, and kidney function and kidney health. And then we have the major route of excretion, which is bowel movements going out through your intestinal system. And so that's kind of like a revisiting just the big picture of how all of this stuff kind of fits together and works together. And just to review very quickly, and I don't want to bore you with this part, but there are three different ways that toxins can accumulate. Because we live in the same world and we eat generally the same diet, breathe the same air, drink the same water, we are all exposed to the same chemicals, but depending on your choice of vocation or avocation, your hobbies, so to speak, you might have some excess exposure. So one way to accumulate extra toxins would be to have some unusual exposure. You might be plagued with what we might call dirty genes, where the genes that control your liver-based enzymes in phase 1, or the things that affect the conjugation systems in phase 2 might not work well. Maybe you've got some genetic glitch in your ability to, for example, make bile through your liver, which is, of course, used to bind your toxins for elimination. And then on the third front, maybe you've got some metabolic interference. Maybe you've got problems with your iron stores. Maybe there's a thyroid issue. Maybe there's some blood sugar problems. Maybe you have a dysbiotic gut. Maybe you've got chronic stress and inflammation, or a combination of all of these things, or some of these things, all of which contribute to interfering with an otherwise fairly normal and robust detoxification capacity. And then finally, just in terms of, actually, this isn't review. This, I think, is a new concept. I don't think we've talked about this yet, but one of the main things that has led into what I typically call the new science of detoxification is a major shift in how we as, and I'm saying collectively, as scientists and clinical practitioners, how we look at toxicity based on human physiology. There was a major shift that happened back in, I'm going to say back in the 1990s or so, which means it's at this point not new, but it's new in the sense that most practicing clinicians have no clue that this shift in the research world really changed. But I want to talk about two different models of toxicity, not from the perspective of what your routes of entry are, whether or not your barrier systems are compromised, whether or not your liver health is doing what it should, or even through talking about the routes of excretion. The different models of toxicity can be broken down into both quantitative and qualitative. And now that I'm saying this, I do realize that I mentioned aspects of this in the last couple of episodes. But the old model of toxicity is strictly a quantitative one, right? And we talked about this before, is that it's very common in the natural medicine world for a clinician or a healthcare practitioner to want to do some kind of quantitative toxin testing or heavy metal testing or something like that. And they might use urine or saliva or hair or whatever the case might be. I said saliva, I should have said stool testing, but it's very common, right? Urine, hair, and then stool testing and blood testing. And all of these kind of have their pros and cons. But nevertheless, the main question that is being asked is, what is your toxin load? Like, how high does a certain level go? And anything that is below a certain threshold is considered to be normal. It's just not a problem, right? Move on and go deal with something else. But I have mentioned before that for some people, when it comes to their toxin load and detoxification, their immune system gets involved. And we'll talk about that again when I lay out what the spectrum or the scale of complexity is as it relates to this conversation. But the new model of detoxification that emerged, again, back in the 90s, so we're talking 30 odd years ago, somewhere around there, is not a quantitative question, but a qualitative question. Is your immune system reacting to some kind of a toxin? And the literature talks about this and calls it a TILT syndrome. TILT, T-I-L-T, which stands for toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. And so, again, we can look at, from a very big picture perspective, look at detoxification challenges in terms of these two different models. We can look strictly at the quantitative aspect, which is great. It's always nice to run, say, a urinary analysis to look at environmental chemicals and heavy metals and mycotoxins, for example, and to see everything come back in the green zone. Everything is normal, but that doesn't answer all of the questions as it relates to things that might be causing suffering and decreased quality of life. We also have to ask this new question, which is the immune system involved? Because the truth is that when the immune system gets involved, even normal amounts of toxins can be a problem, right? So don't be satisfied just with thinking about or actually performing a test, either on your own or for someone else, that says, hey, your quantitative results are all normal. You don't have a problem with environmental toxins. I'm telling you right now, for a lot of us in the Inflammation Nation, you can't stop at that one singular question. You have to ask whether or not the immune system is involved. And, when you kind of delve into the history of the quantitative model, it's really kind of silly. Now, there are really no human studies on this. And that's really kind of an ethical consideration, because you're not going to take, 100 people and expose them to a toxin load and see which ones die and which ones survive, right? So all of these studies that give us quantitative standards, if you will, like how much of X chemical is a safe dose in humans. Basically, what they've done historically is they'll take, usually rabbits, some kind of a rodent, and they will, let's say, just for sake of argument, that they would line them all up. Let's say we have 10 or so of them. And rabbit number 1 gets a small dose. Rabbit number 2 gets a slightly higher dose. Rabbit number 3 gets a slightly higher dose than number 2, all the way up to number 10, which gets the maximum dose of whatever chemical is being studied or toxin. And then they come back sometime later and they see which ones are alive and which ones are not. And so let's say that, rabbits 1 through 4 survived, but 5 through 10 all died. Then they would say, well, the dose that we gave rabbit number 4 is the safe dose. And so let's account for the metabolic differences between rabbits and humans and do some kind of calculation. And so whatever the level was we gave to rabbit number 4 converted into human terms is what we'll consider safe for human exposure. And so we kind of have to look at this, not just the idea of a quantitative analysis is only one side of a two-sided equation or coin, if you will, but we have to look at whether or not it's a valid way to actually study whatever a safe dose is by studying it in animals and converting that to humans. Now, I know that this is what we do in science and research all the time, is that we look at some kind of a health process or health outcome from certain types of interventions, and we study this in animals. and we try to make correlations or conclusions about how these things might affect humans. And sometimes I think those types of studies are quite accurate and they're very helpful. Sometimes I think that certain conclusions drawn from animal studies don't necessarily hold for humans, but that is the art portion of science, if you will, simply because there's no perfect way to do any of these things. And again, ethical considerations prevent us from doing this on humans, and that's probably quite a good thing. But nevertheless, this quantitative model by itself is absolutely insufficient. And so let's talk about this tilt syndrome. In a second, I'm going to read you part of an abstract from a study from, I believe it was 1996, that talks about this. But basically, and I've said this before, with the tilt syndrome, which is a toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, it doesn't take more of a toxin that's already in your system or more than a safe level for you to have a problem. All it takes is losing immunological tolerance to what's already there, even if what's already there is considered a normal quantity, right? Again, this is called a toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. And this is how it was described. And in fact, I think this was the first paper that was published. This was in the Journal of Toxicology in July of 1996. So I did remember that year correctly. I'm not going to read the whole abstract, but I'm just going to read a couple of sentences here, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. According to this theory, and this is the toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or the tilt syndrome theory, a two-step process occurs. Number one, an initial exposure, for example, a one-time or intermittent or continuous exposure to toxins like pesticides, solvents, or air contaminants from, say, a sick building. An initial exposure interacts with a susceptible individual, causing loss of tolerance to everyday low-level chemical inhalants, as well as foods, drugs, alcohol, and caffeine. And number two, thereafter, after that initial sensitization, such common, formerly well-tolerated substances trigger symptoms, thus perpetuating illness. And this is, maybe a more eloquent way of what I said just a moment ago, is that it doesn't take more of what's already there to make you sick. It just takes losing tolerance to it. And so what is tolerance? Let me just kind of redefine that, because this is again, relatively new concept. It's been around in the immunological literature for quite a while. We've been teaching about this in functional medicine seminars for, in my recollection, maybe 8 years or so. But again, nevertheless, it's very new to most docs, because they don't read immunological literature. They don't go to those types of seminars. So these are foreign concepts. But the concept of tolerance is the ability of your immune system to not react to something. And so if you are a person who has a toxin load, which of course you do, but it's not bothering you, it's because you have two things. You have some adequate way to handle and neutralize and excrete these toxins, whether that is a liver-based system or whether that is conjugation with something like glutathione as a natural chelator. Plus, you have immunological tolerance. Now, you might have pretty good liver and glutathione conjugation capacity, but if you lose tolerance, you're in trouble, because now it's your immune system reacting from a qualitative standpoint to things that have already been there. The quantity hasn't changed. It's just how your body reacts to it have changed. Now, and there are nuances where actually these two different models of quantity as well as quality actually do intersect with each other. It's a little bit more complicated than perhaps I want to get into in this podcast discussion. But nevertheless, let's ask the question, what is tolerance, right? It's the capacity of your immune system to not react to something. And that something usually falls into one of three different categories. It's either the food in your diet, it's the chemicals and toxins in your environment, and it's the tissues in your own body. And so when we talk about loss of tolerance, which again is an abnormality of your immune system, when we talk about losing tolerance to the food in your diet, we call that allergy or sensitivity. When we lose tolerance to chemicals in the environment, we might call that chemical sensitivity. And if we lose tolerance to the tissues in our own body, we call that autoimmunity. And these three things tend to happen together because losing tolerance is the problem, and diet and environmental chemicals and your own tissues are just three different ways that this problem can manifest in. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, if you understand how the immune system works in this regard, if you are someone who has chemical sensitivities, there is a very good probability that you have some food sensitivities. And there's a very good probability that you have or will acquire some kind of autoimmunity, which would be largely dependent on what your genetic predisposition is. To translate that into a rule, if you will, and this is something that I've taught doctors for a decade or more now, is that if you see one area where your client has lost tolerance, look for the others. Meaning, if somebody contacts me and says, "Hey doc, I need some help. I just found out that I have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. I just found out that I have multiple sclerosis or type 1 diabetes," or whatever the case is. If it's autoimmunity, one of my first thoughts is, I wonder if you're losing tolerance to chemicals in your environment, and do you have a lot of food sensitivities? Now, this is also a scale and a spectrum. Because maybe you are chemically sensitive, but you do not yet have food sensitivities. Maybe you're chemically sensitive and you do not, as of yet, have a diagnosed autoimmunity. But if you don't do anything about your toxin load, eventually you have all of it. And you might have a lot of chemical sensitivity and a few food sensitivities. You might have a lot of chemical sensitivity and perhaps one autoimmunity that you know of. Or you might have all of it in spades, as the old saying goes. You might have polyautoimmunity, multiple types of autoimmune reactions. You might have massive chemical sensitivity. You might be reacting immunologically to every food you eat, which means you typically cone your diet down to 3 or 4, maybe 5 things that you feel like you can eat safely. The problem is that as you continue to lose tolerance and eat those same foods over and over and over again, you develop sensitivities to the foods that were once safe for you. Because this is not about the food, it's about your immune system. And that's, quite often one of the keys to understanding somebody's complex case and their history is to stop thinking about, well, it's the food that's the problem, or it's my viral load that's the problem. Here's an example. In fact, I just did a lab report for a new client this morning, and she has 3 active viruses. Now, her complaint just happens to be gastritis and some hormonal issues that is leading to hair loss, for example. And in analyzing her initial labs, she has 3 different viruses that are active at the same time. Now, is it the virus that we need to go after? Or is it her lack of immunological tolerance and competence that needs to be restored? Typically, if you get sick with a cold or a flu or something like that, you get one virus, it's short-lived, your immune system conquers it, and then you move on and you're fine. But we have viruses, for example, that live in our bodies forever once we acquire them. Epstein-Barr would be a good example of that. And whether or not that chronic Epstein-Barr presence is a problem or not depends on your immune competence and tolerance. And if your immune competence and tolerance starts to degrade, then that virus that has always been there can activate or come out to play and really kind of mess you up. And so anytime that we see these chronic reactivating viral phenomenon in someone's case and their metabolic complexity, especially if we have more than one virus at a time, we have to consider that the fact that really the virus is not ultimately getting rid of the virus is ultimately our goal, but how we do it is not by attacking the virus per se. It's about restoring your immune system, which might involve at some point using some kind of compound or natural approach to reduce your viral load. But I hope you get what I'm saying is that whether it is multiple chronic viruses or whether it is multiple chronic food sensitivities, it's really not the food that's the issue, it's your immune system. If you're reacting to chemicals, it's really not the chemicals, it's your immune system. If you have autoimmunity, it's not your own tissue, it's your immune system. And again, this shift in perspective and understanding is usually one of the main things that has to happen in the mind of the person, say, I'm working with, for them to really understand what our goals are and what our ultimate outcomes should be. All right, little bunny trail, but nevertheless. All right, let's talk about Let's talk about the scope and scale of detoxification issues. I want you to imagine, just in your mind's eye, and I'm recording this video, and periodically I upload these to YouTube. Of course, I'm not recording my screen, so I guess that's not very helpful for you. But nevertheless, imagine an arrow running across in front of you from left to right, and the left side is the conservative, not a problem side, and the far right is where all your issues get really, really severe. So this is about showing or illustrating a continuum, if you will, where as you move from left to right, things get a lot worse. On the left-hand side where the arrow begins, let's consider this kind of mankind's normal status, where we have a chemical burden, but we have immunological tolerance, and we have a robust liver biotransformation process, and we have adequate glutathione to handle our chemical load. Chemicals come and go. Not a big deal. They come in, we handle them, we excrete them. That would be normal, right? At least in today's day and age. Normal would be we don't have man-made chemicals. But as we slide to the right on that scale, as people begin to struggle either with their biotransformation and chelating capacity or with their immune tolerance, they begin by having what I might call not so obvious symptoms to, let's just use odors as an example, like perfume or gasoline or something like that. I will quite often ask people, like, if you get exposed to strong perfume smell or gas, how does that affect you? And some people will say, well, it doesn't really bother me. I just don't like it, right? They don't get a symptom. They don't get a migraine. They don't get anxiety or palpitations or whatever the case might be. They're like, man, I just don't like it. But what I've observed over the years is that when someone starts there, and they don't clue into the fact that they have an issue on this continuum, then they go from having not so obvious symptoms of just not liking something to now they notice mild, obvious symptoms. Yeah, if I'm around perfume, all of a sudden, after a few minutes, I get a headache. But in the early stages, if they walk out of, say, the department store where they got exposed to a strong perfume odor, then after a few minutes of not being around it, they're fine. But then over time, what ends up happening is they might get exposed and get a headache or brain fog or, fill in the blank that's relevant to that individual person. And all of a sudden, being away from that for 5 or 10 minutes doesn't make a difference, and the headache lasts for hours. And so we have a prolonged symptom type reaction. Or maybe their headache gets that much worse, and it's not just like a pressure headache. Now they get a migraine or a really massive brain fog. And so we go from the mild obvious symptoms to the moderate obvious symptoms that are more intense and more prolonged even after they have escaped, if you will, exposure to that chemical. And then the very far end of this continuum, on the right-hand side of that theoretical arrow that I want you to picture in your mind's eye, is this multiple chemical sensitivity, where you are forced, if you're paying attention, to change all of your personal care products, your household cleaners, even getting to the point where you change textiles or furnitures and the types of clothing that you wear, the detergent that you use. And this, again, this multiple chemical sensitivity, this severity in presentation is classic indication of a loss of tolerance. And again, following the rule, if you see one, look for the others. And so the question is, if you are all the way to the right on this scale and you've lost some degree of tolerance to chemicals, look for sensitivities to foods that you're eating. Look for the potential of autoimmunity. And the potential of autoimmunity is going to be magnified if you have a family history of autoimmunities. Maybe you've not been diagnosed with something like Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, but you have a sister and maybe a cousin on Synthroid, and you've got your grandmother had rheumatoid arthritis, and you have a second cousin with type 1 diabetes. I mean, if you have autoimmunity in your family and you have chemical sensitivity, but you've been not diagnosed with autoimmunity, chances are with that family history, that is part of the picture that you're dealing with. But what you don't want to do is break it down in a reductionist way and try to have a protocol for all the different things. Like, you don't want to go, okay, let me do a quantitative analysis of my toxin load and do a detox. And then I'm going to do something else to manage my Hashimoto's. Maybe I go on Synthroid myself. What you have to do is really step back and go, okay, how do all of these things link together? And yes, maybe going on some kind of thyroid hormone replacement is a smart idea. Maybe doing a detox is a good idea. Again, if your bowels aren't moving, remember what I said at the end of last episode, if your bowels aren't moving yet every day, do not do a detox, just don't do it. And so, the whole point of giving you these mental frameworks and explaining to you how you should think about how all these pieces fit together is incredibly valuable for you to understand what's happening, how everything is interlinked, and ultimately what is in your power to accomplish. Because remember, the whole point of this, and I said this at the beginning of this episode, so I'll just repeat it and then we'll probably close out this episode here, is that being autonomous and having autonomous health is learning to do for yourself what is under your control. And if that includes detox, great. I want you to understand and know what goes into making that kind of a decision. And as you can see, it's a lot more complicated, or can be, than just simply going to your health food store and buying some milk thistle, which I'm telling you is what a lot of people do. And I hate to say it, it's what a lot of practitioners do. Oh, let's detox everyone from the beginning with no other thought process or no consideration in asking the question, well, where are they in the scope and scale of toxicity? Do they have any symptoms from it? If so, are they short-lived? Are they prolonged? Are they mild, moderate, severe? And are they occurring in the context of the possibility of having lost tolerance to your environment, to your diet, as well as to your own tissues? So as you can see, it's not as black and white as most practitioners would want it to be, and certainly as black and white as most healthcare consumers, perhaps like yourself, would like it to be. And that makes it difficult for self-care, admittedly, but I think that's exactly why podcasts like this are important and they're valuable. And some of the self-care programs that I've produced on my website, whether it's for Hashimoto's or just autoimmunity in general, or my 3D detox program, I think these are invaluable tools for people to avail themselves of. So if you want to check it out, and we'll talk more about the 3D detox self-paced do-it-yourself program as we continue on. We still have many different topics to cover in our little mini series about detoxification. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.